The morning I found out, I was sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. I remember that detail specifically. The coffee. I'd poured it, sat down, opened my banking app to check something routine, and just forgot to drink it. By the time I set my phone down, it was stone cold, and I didn't care at all. My name is Linda. I'm 63 years old, recently retired from 28 years in hospital administration, and I live alone in the same house in Naperville, Illinois, where I raised my 2 children. My husband, Frank, passed away 6 years ago from a heart attack. Sudden. No warning. One Tuesday morning he was here, and by that evening he wasn't. That's the kind of thing that changes how you see everything. Your house, your routines, your relationships, your money, your sense of what matters. After Frank died, I pulled my family close. Maybe too close. That's the honest truth of it, and I've had a lot of time to sit with that. My son is 34. His wife. I'll call her my daughter-in-law, because that's what she is, even now, is 31. They've been married for 5 years. They live about 20 minutes from me, in a townhouse that they rent, in a neighborhood that's perfectly nice. My son works in sales. His wife works part-time at a salon. Between the two of them, they do fine. Not lavishly, but fine. I want to be clear about that, because it matters to the story. They were not struggling. They were not in crisis. What happened wasn't desperation. That's the part I keep coming back to. It started 3 years ago, maybe a little more. My son called me one evening and said his car had broken down, the transmission, he thought, and the repair estimate was around $1,800. He said he and his wife were short that month because they'd had some unexpected medical bills, and could I help? Of course I said yes. I wired the money. A few months later, his wife's car needed new tires and a brake job. Could I help with that? Yes, I helped. Then it was a vet bill for their dog. Then a security deposit when they moved to a new place. Then Christmas. They were hosting his wife's family and wanted to make it nice. Could I chip in for groceries and a few gifts? I chipped in. Each time I said yes without much thought. This is what mothers do, I told myself. Frank would have done the same thing. We never wanted our children to struggle if we could prevent it. Here's the thing about being the kind of person who says yes easily. You don't always notice when yes stops being a choice and starts being an expectation. I had a checking account and a savings account, both at the same credit union. I also had a credit card, a Visa, through that same credit union, with a $15,000 limit. I'd had it for years and almost never carried a balance. I paid it off every month. It was attached to autopay, and because I trusted that system, I'll be honest, I didn't look at the statements carefully. I'd log in, see the autopay had gone through, and close the app. I'm a retired hospital administrator. I know better, but trust makes you lazy in ways you don't see until later. About 18 months ago, my son called and asked if he could be added to my credit card account as an authorized user. He said it was temporary, just a few months, because he'd had a late payment flag on his credit and he was trying to rebuild his score. He said he just needed access to the card for emergencies, that he'd never use it for anything without asking me first. He said it so simply, so matter-of-factly, the way he used to ask if he could have a friend over for dinner. I said fine. I should have asked more questions. I know that now. The first charge I might have noticed, if I'd been paying attention, was in November. $47 at a restaurant I didn't recognize. I assumed I'd forgotten the lunch. In December, there was a charge at a department store, $112. I thought maybe my son had used the card for a Christmas gift, which felt okay, which felt like what I'd implicitly agreed to when I said for emergencies. I let it go. By February, the auto-pay amount was higher than usual. Not dramatically, maybe $60 more than my average. I noticed it for a second and then moved on. This is the thing I want to say, because I've read the comments people leave on videos like this, and I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, how do you not check your statements? And the answer is not that I'm stupid. The answer is that I was a 61-year-old woman who trusted her son, who had auto-pay set up, who had been trained by decades of routine to assume that the bill was what it was. I wasn't checking line items. I was seeing a number, confirming it cleared, and moving on with my life. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand how these things happen. Not to excuse it, just to explain it. The real shift happened in March. My son called me on a Wednesday evening and said that he and his wife were planning a trip, a long weekend in Charleston, South Carolina. He said his wife's birthday was coming up and he wanted to do something special, and could he use the card for the hotel? Just the hotel. He'd cover everything else. Now, I want to pause here, because this is the moment I should have felt something. Looking back, there was a flicker, a small hesitation. My son had never asked to use the card explicitly before. He'd just used it, and I hadn't noticed. This was the first time he was asking out loud. Something about that struck me as slightly off, but he was already talking about how much his wife would love Charleston, and I let the flicker pass. I said yes. I told him to keep it reasonable. He said, of course. He said, thanks, Mom. He said he'd bring me back pralines. He did not bring me pralines. What I found out, much later, was that the Charleston trip cost $1,400 on my card. The hotel alone was over $800. They also charged meals, a carriage tour, a spa treatment, and 2 bottles of wine from room service. I know all of this because I eventually went back through my statements line by line. But that was later. In March, I knew none of it. I found out what was happening in June, and I found out the way I find out everything now. Through my phone. I was sitting in my living room on a Saturday afternoon, half watching a home renovation show, when my phone buzzed with a notification from my credit union's app. I'd turned on transaction alerts a few weeks earlier, not because I suspected anything, but because my friend, she's been my closest friend since our kids were in elementary school together, had told me she'd caught a fraudulent charge early because of an alert. So I turned them on, purely as a general habit. The alert said, transaction approved, $623.14, restaurant name I didn't recognize. I sat up straighter. $623 at a restaurant on a Saturday afternoon. I hadn't left my house. I opened the app, and that's when I started scrolling. You know how in movies, when someone discovers something terrible, they play dramatic music and show the person's face going through a whole cascade of emotions in slow motion? It's not like that in real life. In real life, you scroll, and at first your brain keeps trying to explain things away. That must be the grocery charge from last month. That must be the Amazon order I forgot about. That might be, wait. There was a charge in April at a high-end steakhouse in Chicago, $480. There was a charge in late April at Nordstrom, $260. There was a charge in May at a resort hotel in Michigan City, Indiana. Over $1,100 spread across 2 transactions, the way a multi-day stay looks when they charge you per night. There was a charge 2 weeks ago at a day spa, $175. And now, today, $623 at a restaurant. I put my phone down on the couch cushion next to me. I picked it back up. I put it down again. Then I opened my full statement history. Not just recent notifications, but everything. And I went back to November, all the way back to November. When I finished, I had a number. Over the 18 months since my son had been added to my account, there were charges I could not explain. Charges I never made, charges I was never told about, charges at places I have never been that totaled a little over $9,000. $9,000. I sat with that number for a long time. The renovation show was still on in the background. Someone was arguing about crown molding. I remember thinking that was funny, in a completely unfunny way. I didn't call my son that afternoon. I didn't call anyone. I needed to think clearly, and I knew that if I picked up the phone in that moment, I would either say things I couldn't take back, or I would let him explain it all away, because he is my son, and I have spent 34 years being willing to believe the best of him. Instead, I called my friend. She came over within the hour. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, looked at the list I'd printed out. I'd actually printed it out, all 3 pages, and she was quiet for a minute. Then she said, very gently, "Linda, this is not an accident." I knew she was right. I'd known it since I'd seen the steakhouse charge. You don't accidentally have a $480 steak dinner on your mother's card. You make a choice. She asked me what I wanted to do. I said I didn't know yet, but I knew I wasn't going to let it continue. The $600 charge that had come in while I was sitting on my couch. I'd looked it up by then. It was a restaurant about 4 miles from my son's townhouse. A nice place. The kind of place with linen napkins and a sommelier. My son had texted me that morning to say he and his wife were having a low-key Saturday and did I want to come for dinner later in the week. A low-key Saturday. I thought about that for a while. The next morning, Sunday, my son called. He asked how I was doing. He mentioned, casually, that he and his wife had gone out the night before, just to a little neighborhood spot, nothing fancy. He said it like you say something you've already decided isn't worth mentioning. Like filler, I said, "That sounds nice." And I said nothing else. After we hung up, I called my credit union. I spoke to someone in account services and explained the situation. I asked about my options. She told me I could remove my son as an authorized user, which would immediately cancel his card. I could also dispute specific charges if I had documentation that they were unauthorized, though since I'd added him myself, that process was complicated and not guaranteed. She also told me I could freeze the card temporarily through the app at any time, which would prevent any new charges from going through. I want to be careful about how I describe what I did next, because I've thought about it a lot, and I want to be honest about my reasoning. I did not freeze the card right away. I waited. This will sound strange, but I needed to see it with my own eyes. I needed to not have any doubt. Not in myself. Not in what I was going to say to my son. And that meant I needed to see him do it. Or try to do it. Because as long as I only had a list of charges on a statement, there was a part of my brain that would let him explain. It's a mother's brain. It looks for the exit, the excuse, the alternate interpretation. I needed to close that door. My son texted me on Tuesday. He said he and his wife were going to dinner Friday evening. Her colleague was in town visiting and asked if it was okay to use the card just for dinner out. He said he'd been meaning to ask. He said it like a formality, like he was filling out a permission slip. I stared at that text for a long time. Then I typed back, "Of course, have a nice time." I found the restaurant by looking up the charge that came in that evening. They'd made a reservation. I know because I called ahead and confirmed a table was booked under my son's name. I got in my car at 7 o'clock on Friday night and drove there. I want to tell you what it feels like to walk into a restaurant looking for your own son. It feels like the ground is slightly soft beneath your feet, like gravity is doing something different than usual. I was wearing my good wool coat, the charcoal one I bought on sale 2 winters ago, and I had my phone in my hand and I walked in like I was meeting someone, because technically I was. The hostess stand was near the entrance. Past it, I could see the dining room, warm lighting, white tablecloths, the quiet clink of glasses and silverware. It smelled like garlic and butter and something charred in the best possible way. I saw them at a table near the window. My son, his wife, and a woman I didn't recognize, who I assumed was the colleague. They had wine. They had appetizers. My son was laughing at something, leaning back in his chair the way he does when he's comfortable and happy, the way he's done since he was a teenager. His wife was gesturing with her hands as she talked. The colleague was smiling. They looked completely at ease. I stood there for a moment. Nobody had seen me yet. The hostess was asking if I had a reservation, and I said no, I was just going to let someone know I'd arrived. She smiled and stepped aside. I walked to their table. My son looked up mid-laugh. The laugh stopped. "Mom," he said. "What are you?" "I was in the neighborhood," I said. Which was not true, but it wasn't the point. Don't let me interrupt. I just wanted to say hello. There was a long, strange pause. His wife said hello. The colleague smiled politely. My son looked at me the way you look at something that doesn't make sense yet. I stayed for about 4 minutes. I made small talk. I asked how the appetizers were. I said the place looked lovely. I said I'd better let them get back to their evening. Then I walked out to the sidewalk, stood next to my car, and opened my banking app. I pressed freeze. It took 2 seconds. I got home, made chamomile tea, and sat down at the kitchen table. My phone was face up on the table. I watched it. 22 minutes later, my son called. I let it ring once. Then I answered. He said the card had been declined. He said there must be some kind of error. He said it was embarrassing. They were sitting there with the check. Could I please unfreeze it? I said I know about Charleston. Silence. I said I know about the steakhouse in April. I know about Nordstrom. I know about the resort in Michigan City. I know about the spa. I know about last Saturday. More silence. The kind of silence that is actually a confession. Then he said very quietly, Mom. I said, I added up the charges. The ones I didn't make and wasn't told about. It's over $9,000. I heard his wife's voice in the background, low, urgent. I couldn't make out the words. I said, I'm not unfreezing the card tonight. You'll need to figure out the check another way. I'm sure between the two of you have a card. He started to say something about how he'd meant to tell me, about how things had been hard, about how he'd planned to pay it back. And I said, we'll talk, but not tonight. I hung up. I sat in my quiet kitchen and drank my tea and looked at the dark window above the sink and thought about Frank. I thought about what he would have said. Frank was more practical than me in most things. He would have checked the statement. He would have caught it in January. He probably would not have driven to the restaurant either. He would have just made the call and been done with it. But I'm not Frank. I needed to see it. My son came to the house the next morning. His wife stayed in the car. He sat across from me at the same kitchen table where I'd had the cold coffee, and he talked for a long time. He said things were tighter than they'd let on. He said he'd told himself it was temporary and he'd pay it back before I noticed. He said he knew it was wrong. He said he was sorry. I listened to all of it. Then I said, you didn't ask me because you knew I might say no. And if I'd said no, that would have been my answer, and you would have had to respect it. What you did instead was decide your answer for me. He didn't say anything. I said, that's not an emergency. That's a choice. We sat with that for a while. I told him that I loved him. That part was easy to say and true. I also told him that the credit card was closed, not frozen, closed, and that his name would be removed by the end of the week. I told him that the $9,000 was not a gift, and we would need to work out a repayment plan in writing with a schedule. He looked like he'd expected me to be angrier. Or softer. Maybe both at different points. I was neither. I was just tired. He agreed to the repayment plan. His wife came inside eventually. She apologized briefly in the way people apologize when they're ashamed, but also still a little defensive. I accepted it. What else do you do? It's been several months now. My son has made 3 payments, modest ones, but consistent. We've had dinners together, awkward at first and then less so. The colleague from that Friday night apparently picked up the restaurant tab when the card was declined. I heard that secondhand, and I'll admit, I felt a flicker of grim satisfaction at the image of it. But mostly what I feel is something harder to name. When you raise a child, you want to believe that the love you gave them translated into something, into character, into gratitude, into a person who would not look their mother in the eye and call it a low-key Saturday while spending her money at a linen tablecloth restaurant. But children are their own people. They make their own choices, and sometimes the kindest thing you ever did, the open hand, the yes, the trust, is the exact thing they used against you. I still have the statement printout. 3 pages, folded in half, in the drawer where I keep important papers. I'm not sure why I kept it. Maybe as a reminder. Not to be hard, not to be bitter, but to be clear-eyed. To look at what trust without accountability actually costs. My friend came over last week for coffee. The real kind, not forgotten on the table. We sat in the kitchen and talked about nothing important for a while, and then she asked how I was doing, really doing. I told her I was okay. I told her I'd made peace with the part I played in it. The years of open-handed, yes, the auto-pay laziness, the unwillingness to look too closely because looking closely felt like distrust. She said, "You were being a mother." I said, "I was being careless." She said both could be true. She's right. Both are true. And sitting with that, not in shame, not in anger, just in clear sight, is the best I can do with it now. I turned on the transaction alerts. I review my statement every month, every line, without exception. I have one credit card in my name alone, and it will stay that way. Some things you should only have to learn once. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened. Not in an abstract way, in the very specific, kitchen table way that you think about things when you're 63 and sitting with a 3-page printout of charges you didn't make. Here's what I've come to understand. What happened with my son didn't start the night I walked into that restaurant. It started years earlier, with every time I said yes without asking questions. Every transfer, every covered bill, every time I handed something over and called it love and moved on. I was the one who built the condition, not intentionally, not out of weakness exactly, but out of a habit of generosity that I never stopped to examine. When you give without boundaries for long enough, you don't just help someone, you teach them something. And what I taught my son, without meaning to, was that asking was optional. That's the honest, uncomfortable part. And I think it matters to say it plainly, because the easy version of this story is that my son is the villain, and I'm the victim. And that's not quite right. I was careless with trust in a way that made it easy for someone I loved to be careless with my money. Both things are true at the same time. What I kept coming back to in the weeks after was the word emergencies. He'd asked to be added to my account for emergencies. And somewhere along the way, maybe the first time he used it for something that wasn't an emergency and nothing happened, the definition shifted. In his mind, and without my knowing it, emergency became whenever. That's not a sudden moral collapse, that's a slow drift. And slow drifts happen when there's no guardrail, no accountability, no moment where someone says, "Wait, let's be clear about what this is." I didn't build that guardrail. That's on me. What I'm prouder of is what I did when I finally looked. I didn't talk myself out of it. I didn't let the love I have for him convince me that the numbers meant something other than what they meant. I looked at the printout, I sat with it, and I let myself know what I knew. That took something. Not courage exactly. More like the willingness to be uncomfortable on purpose. Because the alternative was to keep being comfortable in a way that was costing me. Driving to that restaurant on a Friday night in my wool coat, that was me deciding to see clearly instead of conveniently. And freezing the card before the check came was not revenge. It was just the first moment in a long time where I was acting on my own behalf. The repayment plan is not about the money, not entirely. It's about making the thing real. Accountability has to have a shape. It can't just be an apology over coffee and a promise to do better. My son is making payments. We're rebuilding something, slowly, on ground that's more honest than what we had before. That's worth something. I turned on transaction alerts. I review every line of every statement. I have one card in my name alone. These are small, practical things. But they're also the shape of a different kind of self-respect. The kind that says I will pay attention to what belongs to me, because paying attention is not distrust. It's just being awake. Some things you can only learn by going through them. I'd rather have learned this one differently. But I learned it, and that's what I'm keeping.